Welcome to the next podcast from Millinery.Info. I'm your host, Lauren Ritchie. Thank you for joining me today for this episode with Stephanie Spencer. Stephanie is the winner of the 2020 Myer Millinery Awards. She joins us today to share about making the winning piece and what it's like to work from her studio in Collingwood, Melbourne. Thank you to our wonderful podcast sponsors for making this episode possible. Be Unique Millinery, Hatters Millinery Supplies, the Millinery Association of Australia, Katherine Cherry Millinery, Hat Academy, The Essential Hat, Hat Atelier, Louise McDonald Milliner, That Millinery, House of Adorn, Lifted Millinery, and Hat Mags. You can find a link to each of their businesses in our show notes, either through your podcast app or on our website. If you have been enjoying listening to this podcast series, there's a few ways which you could show your support. You could become a Patreon podcast sponsor or supporter by going to www.patreon.com/Millinery.Info to find out more or sign up. Another way you could show your support is by sharing your favourite episode with a friend. I love making these podcasts and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for joining me to talk hats today, Stephanie. You're the winner of this year's 2020 Millinery Award for Flemington Racecourse. Congratulations. And let's start with that piece. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Hi, thank you for having me. My piece for the 2020 Millinery Award is essentially a pair of point shoes built to scale, sit atop your head. They're very vertical and made from parisisal, and they have got ribbons of ginseng that swirl all around them.
It's a beautiful piece, and we'll share some photos on our website and our socials of them. How did you come up with the point shoe concept?
That's a good question. I essentially don't really know, but I kind of do in a bit of a way. That probably doesn't make any sense at all. In all fairness, I was just standing in my kitchen doing my dishes one night, thinking about concepts and ideas and objects around me, and I thought, oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. I like that. Bear in mind, we were in the deep, dark depths of 8 months of Melbourne lockdown, and I was thinking about all of the things that were going on around me, and all of the things that I was missing, and all of the things as a community we were maybe pining for, and nothing was really making sense, and everything seemed a little bit wayward and upside down. And I kind of thought the concept of an upside down hat, which was essentially really surreal, which was something that we were all experiencing at the time as well, was a really kind of interesting concept. Additionally, I have been dancing as a hobby for the past 8 years or so, and it's just this really nice thing that I like to go to and see my friends, and you can kind of sweat the week out, and that was something I was really missing during lockdown, and I thought point shoes were a really nice way to kind of encapsulate that, and they were a really lovely emblem and symbol of what dancing is, really.
That's beautiful. And how did you create, because they are physical point shoes, how did you create that amazing shape?
In lockdown, we couldn't just pop to the shops. Nothing was open, so that came with its extra kind of difficulties. So I found a pair of point shoes on Facebook Marketplace and had them sent to me. Then I kind of just rummaged around my studio for materials. I decided that I didn't want to buy anything new unless I really, really had to. So I pulled apart a lot of bits and pieces that I had and projects that I'd started even up to kind of like 3-4 years ago. The most difficult thing, I think, to begin with, obviously, was making the block. And you can't really just buy a pair of ballet shoes hat block. So I kind of sat on that for a couple of weeks, and I got some paper clay from Bunnings, click and collect. And my housemate works in costume for Disney, and we're constantly bouncing ideas off each other and creative problem solving, pardon me. And I said, I need something really squishy and pliable and something that I can mold the shoes out of that I can then cover in paper clay. And she goes, why don't you just use alfoil? And I was like, that is a brilliant idea, Sophie, you're so clever. Molded that, not directly off the shoe, but just from sight. And then covered the block with layers and layers of really heavy duty woodworking glue, which proved to be really successful. So yeah.
How far out from the competition did this start to come together for you?
Well, the competition was only announced, I think, 6 weeks before kind of it eventuated. So there wasn't a huge amount of time to not do anything about it. I'd come up with the idea a few months back, and I'd just scribbled on a note in my studio wall, and it's just like ballet shoes with like exclamation points. So I knew if it eventuated this year that would be something that I wanted to create.
So how did you go about constructing this shoe essentially?
I really wanted to honor the construction of the point shoes. So I broke down the components and thought about how I could repurpose my materials for each part. There's an exterior of parisisal. The lining is made from parisisal as well. There are different capillines, and the interior is like a slightly different pink shade, which I thought was really lovely and created a very subtle but nice contrast. They needed to be as light as possible. So there is a support of Paris net just between each layer. The sole is blocked from parisisal again with a support of buckram, and there is a suede exterior of the sole, pardon me. And to finish the piece, I made a bias binding to finish the edge of the shoes. That's made from silk with a very fine wadding.
And that's quite because it ended up being so fine. How did the wadding go around that shape? That would have been quite a stitching challenge.
Yeah, well, I'd originally put the binding on and you could see the texture of the straw, and I just thought, this is not going to cut it. So took it back off, stretched the wadding really finely, basted it on, and then put the binding back over, and it just had this really nice subtle volume about it.
And then you had your shaped, I'm going to say ribbons?
My ginseng that I had shaped, and then the swirls that would come up, the ribbons of the points. Quite nice. I just really wanted to create this sense of movement, to have the ribbons really encompassing this kind of sense of freedom that you get when you're dancing.
It's beautiful. And had you entered the competition before?
I had. I've entered twice, and I haven't. I'd never placed at all. Like even made it past a final. I never thought I would win this competition. I work in quite a detailed and intricate way, and I think that can be really difficult to translate in a piece for competition. I just think the circumstances that we had this year worked in my favour, because I had the time that I could dedicate to the piece, which is something that, in past years just doesn't happen. So I think that was an asset. I really just could go and sit in my studio for hours and hours and think about the best approach for the next step.
I think you half stole my next question. I was going to ask if this was I'm going to say a normal year, quote unquote. Is this? Do you think this is a piece you would have made anyway for the competition, or this was specifically probably a COVID piece?
Well, I came up with the concept during COVID, but when I thought about it, I knew it was a strong concept. So if the competition hadn't eventuated this year, then I would have, kept it for next year. But it made sense for this year. And I was kind of honoring the interesting time that we were having at the time. So.
Yeah, it had an impact.
It did, yeah.
So I'd love to jump back of how did you first become involved in millinery?
I studied, I did a BA in fashion and textiles at Curtin in WA, moved to Melbourne 10 years ago. I didn't know specifically that I wanted to do millinery, but I'd always been quite interested in it. But when I moved here, I was just so bright-eyed, and I just thought, I want to work in fashion. I just really want to work in a creative industry. My first job was in sales at Myer, where I met Richard Nylon, and he was running a course with, I think, MFI the next year. So I enrolled in a 1-year course with him. And as soon as I applied the knowledge that I had from my degree and kind of how I worked to millinery, the transition was so seamless. I just felt the way that I worked in millinery was more effective than in fashion design. I'd also always been really interested in lingerie construction, and I focused on lingerie when I was in uni. And the parallels between handmade lingerie and hats are not dissimilar. Everything is round. Everything's quite, well, for the way that I work, everything is quite intricate, and there's a really kind of tactile handmade sensibility about kind of both processes. So I started making hats, and I was like, oh, this is good. I'm loving this. Before I moved to Melbourne, Valtraud Reiner had come to Perth, and I did, it must have been maybe 21, 22. She did a 3-day course, and I attended that, and I had no idea. I had no idea what any of the materials were. I had hardly seen a hat block in my entire life. And by the end of day 1, I was hooked. Like it was such a beautiful and memorable weekend. And I think the process of making my first hat then made a big impression on me. So when I came over here, I thought, oh, I think I might give that another go. So.
Absolutely. And when you started making, hats for the first time, did you feel you had quite a strong aesthetic already, having your fashion degree background?
Yeah,
or was that a process that evolved?
Yeah, I think so. I had created an aesthetic of my own in fashion, like when I was studying fashion, and that definitely came with me to millinery as well.
Yeah. And from that course you did with Richard, how did it evolve from there?
I kind of started applying myself a lot more when I got a studio space, maybe 3 years later. So I was just having fun, like I was just dabbling, but it was something that brought me so much joy when I was making hats. So I applied myself when I got a studio space in Collingwood. Then I popped in to see Valtraud one day at Torben Reiner to buy a few bits and pieces, and she said, would you like a job? And I said, I would love one. Thank you. So then I worked at Torben Reiner which is now Millinery Hub, for 3-4 years, and going to work every day was so great. I loved it. I loved learning about the materials. I loved learning about the processes. I loved that Vulture would come in I loved that she would always, kind of say, well, you should do things this way. This is the way that we do things. That sort of thing. So that was a huge learning curve for me. And yeah, something like a really lovely time in my life.
Could you describe the aesthetic of your hats?
Oh, I don't. That's a interesting question. Obviously, with everyone's artistic practice or creative practice, everything always evolves. I really enjoy making quite bigger brimmed hats, and I like it because I kind of see wider brimmed hats as a canvas. So I like to apply a lot of the techniques that I maybe learned during my fashion and textiles course to hats, which is quite good fun. But I do think I've got quite a bit of a minimal but a very feminine aesthetic. It's a pretty experimental.
Like you do things like you do paint effects, splatters, if you will. And I think I've seen one of yours that's like it was a natural hat, but you beaded maybe leopard kind of print design onto it.
I like I really love the idea of applying handwork to hats. So I'm quite into embroidering bits and pieces. That hat was now when people say how long does it take to make a hat, I would say that took way too long. Way too long. But I embroidered it was about a 48 centimeter wide straw hat with leopard spots with black embroidery thread, DMC thread. So that was a very long process, and I maybe did an hour or two each night for at least a couple of months. I never kind of make a hat to go, oh, what's the best profit margin? Like, how can I find the best profit margin in this? Like, it's kind of not really the approach that I take, but it's something that I wanted to do, and I was really happy with it when it was done.
I think, each, it doesn't, making's an interesting process in that way, because you are a creative, and in this case it's a textile art as well when you're doing something like that. So it's about expressing your brand and your aesthetic, but also there's also hats that you make because the profit margin's good as well. So it's a different game.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's not kind of one starting and stopping point with everything. It's always a bit of a creative journey, and what might not work in one piece, well, you can kind of extrapolate the successful ideas and move them onto something else. And yeah.
Do you make a collection each year? I know you have a website that has showcases your work on it. Do you make a collection each year, or do you kind of have a constant flow of products that you're releasing? How do you work that?
To answer your question in one sentence, yes and no. I do make a collection every year. I make a collection for spring. And I think it's really interesting how differently everyone works. But I like to, about February, March, I'll start to, things are a little bit different this year and will be next year. But around February, March, I'll start to just collate ideas, colours, textures, and, inspiration could be like just absolutely anything. And I think that's a really fun way of working is, I don't know, looking at like a car, for example, or someone's t-shirt on the street or something like that, and just seeing how, and just like building like a kind of mental storyboard to move forward from there. So yeah, start about February, March, and I like to start one piece and then not finish it, and then start another piece and not finish it, and then you've got 30 hats that need to get finished, but somehow it's looking okay. So that's generally how I like to work. So I'm never a start and finish kind of a person. I like to make things as difficult for myself as possible, panic around August, and then really put my head down. There's far more efficient ways of working, and I don't do it that way.
And do you shoot those hats to yourself, or do you have a team that you work with to?
I'm a one-man band for sure, but I also think that this is this is the interesting thing about starting off as a creative and then building a business. You are not just trying to make nice things, but you're also trying to you're creative problem solving, but you are just ABC problem solving all of the time. And that's the kind of stuff that I have had to learn and teach myself and seek out. And you don't just start a business and the answers are in your lap. It is really hard, and it's really frustrating at times, and it can be really exhausting, but it's really rewarding. You meet some amazing people and you become a part of this really special community.
It's amazing. And you have your own studio space that you work in. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's quite something that's quite special.
Being a bit of a newbie to Melbourne, I've always lived in share houses and what have you. So the luxury of having a home studio is not something that I have quite got my hands on yet. But having said that, I have worked from 2 different studio spaces in Collingwood for the last 8 years. The first place that I worked from was an open plan with a bunch of creatives. There were lots of girls about my age that were independent makers and designers as well. And what I learned from the people that I first shared with was so priceless. I'm in a studio now, which is 20 meters away on the next street. And actually, I've just moved into a bigger space this week. I had 10 square meters as of this time last week, and now I have 20 square meters. Because you could not walk on my floor. It was pretty bad. So I have a big, beautiful, light, airy studio now. I have a pretty impressive shelving system for all of my stuff. I'm feeling pretty good about my space at the moment. And it's really nice to be able to go to and shut my door and put some podcasts on and just get to work.
Absolutely. And what does I'm going to say usual, but I understand we're in strange times, but maybe in a future dream scenario, what does a week in your business look like?
Well, every morning I have to get up and do my admin and my emails first thing in the morning. Like, I get up quite early and I go straight to my computer, and so I'll get all of those bits and pieces done, get them out the way. If you get an email from me at 3:00 in the afternoon, that is a rarity. Then I will go to my studio. I work during the day in the same way that I'll kind of put a collection together. Work on one thing at once or one thing on another. If I've got a deadline, which is not unusual, I'm pretty good at just going in, shutting the door, and I won't come out for 12 hours, 14 hours until it's done. So yeah, and then I don't know, leave about 6. I used to be much better at doing late nights. I don't know how I did it, but I would usually work until about midnight each night, but doesn't really sound all that enticing anymore. So, yeah.
And do you have clients come to your studio to purchase from you, or where do you sell your hats?
Mostly through my website. Very rarely will people come to my studio. It's really not set up so much as a showroom. It's really more as a kind of a working studio space. most of my pieces I'll sell through my website or Instagram and post them out. On the whole, yeah.
And does that do you do custom orders, or do you just work from the stock that you have?
No, the majority of sales that I make are from custom orders. So it's quite a it's a very one-on-one process. It's very custom. Yeah, I find that that's the best way to work, and I like working that way. I really enjoy working with a client to create something that's unique and is tailored to maybe their dress, the occasion, their style in general. I find that is the most rewarding.
What's one of the favorite pieces you have made?
Maybe not pieces, but things that I've worked on, or things that I felt like a process that I felt most proud of. I did a collection for the finale of Vamp a couple of years ago, and like I love seeing my hats on I love seeing my hats at the races, I do, but it was so like baby fashion stuff when I saw my hats on the runway at Vamp. Was such a nice moment for me, just seeing it in that kind of catwalk context. That was really great. And I made the hats. So I collaborated with Tony Matuszewski for his showcase for Vamp this year, which was the night before Melbourne went into its first lockdown. So that was great. But that was a really nice process. The mood boards that I got for that were really interesting, and it was really fun to create something with from inspiration that I would never usually look to.
That's amazing. I think that's such a lovely little conclusion there. Thank you so much for chatting hats with me. It's been lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Lauren.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Millinery.Info with Stephanie. I'd like to thank our Patreon podcast sponsors, Be Unique Millinery, Hatters Millinery Supplies, the Millinery Association of Australia, Katherine Cherry Millinery, Hat Academy, The Essential Hat, Hat Atelier, Louise McDonald Milliner, That Millinery, House of Adorn, Lifted Millinery, and Hat Mags. You can find a link to each of their businesses in our show notes. That's either on your podcast app or through our website. We really appreciate their support, so check out these amazing businesses. You and your business could become a Patreon of Millinery.Info. There are 2 tiers to select from. A podcast sponsor, which means your event or business is mentioned in our podcast. A link is included on our website and in the monthly newsletter. This starts from just $15 per month. We've recently introduced the supporter tier, which starts from $5. It's for those who might like to more quietly show their support, so we can keep producing the content you see on Millinery.Info. If you have any questions about becoming a Patreon, I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, you can visit www.patreon.com/Millinery.Info to sign up. I'm your host, Lauren Ritchie. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I look forward to talking hats with you again soon.